girl on the desk was, I went and booked in, went and sat down, and I heard her phone someone up, and she was saying, yes, he's here now, you can come and see him. And I'm thinking, oh, some poor soul's going to be up for the chop at one of these research scholars, you know. And lo and behold, in walks this young man, long white coat, brown shoes, stumbled over, and we started a dialogue. And he asked me if I'd go and do some, would you come to a room and do some trends with me, you know. And I thought, well, you know, he's not a bad chap, I'll go along and we'll see what happens. But he did something very different. Very, very different. And, you know, it marks him out as very different to many, many researchers. Instead of just going in there, sitting on the other side of the desk and asking me questions and presenting me with things to do, he sat on the front of the desk, which was different in those days. Not a lot of people did that. But he did one other thing that marked him out as very, very different. He asked me what the consequences were of my disability. No one had ever asked that before. They were all intrigued about what the, you know, what the loss was, but no one had actually asked, you know, how do you live with this? How do you cope? How do you do buttons up? This was a guy that understood I couldn't do buttons very well, and balance and all those sort of things, you know. So that's why I went off down the path of doing research with Jonathan. But over recent years, I've started, and I you know, it's about a relationship. When you have a disability that's somewhat different, and there's not many of you around, you know, you get invited to a lot of places, you know, to do research. And Jonathan does the technical. I just do the lippy bit that supports it. You know, I mean, Jonathan does all that sort of stuff, and it, you know. But it's about a relationship, though. We do have to engage with each other. I have a lot of tricks and strategies that I can apply when I undertake some of the tasks. And I don't know, Jonathan never tells me what they are before we go, but I always say to him, is it worthy? And he always says yes. So I trust him. It's about trust. I trust him to have taken away all the silly requests that we get, and, you know, we go to places where they do some unusual things. And it is a relationship built on trust, but it's also built on a dialogue and a communication, not just with Jonathan, but with the researcher on the day that we get there. Because, you know, I may do something differently the second time we go back if we're lucky enough to be invited again. And so it's all about communication and strategies. Jonathan put something in the book once about the psychology of cheating, which, you know, nice title, but, you know, it's not that I cheat. I am competitive, a bit, but it's just that I may not apply the same strategy next time we visit, do the same expansion. So it's all about dialogue. And when we roll up to do this sort of stuff, you know, I like to spend a bit of time chatting about how we're going to do it and how we may take away some of the visual clues. I mean, we were chatting yesterday at a very nice restaurant, and we were talking about, I was asked about, you know, what one of my strategies or what one of my tricks might be, and I said, well, maybe, you know, sort of close my eyes and touching my nose. You know, I missed them here, but, you know, and I said that's quite a simple trick. You can perform that, and people think, oh, he's cured, you know. Nothing at all. It's just that your arm can only go there, you know. And I felt the temperature of it achieving that, you know. So I know, I told it to go there. I know it's gone there. It's in trouble if it didn't. And when you fold, it goes there. You know, you find these silly things out when you're exploring how to trick your doctor next time you see him and he wants to do that silly test or neurologist. Or run your heel down your shin. You know, there's tricks around that as well. But they are tricks and strategies and things that you can do. So you need to unravel that from the beginning and find out what they're doing and how they're applying these things. Otherwise, you're not going to get the best results or the best understanding of what you know we're offering. Sorry if I went off at a tangent, but I thought it might be a bit relevant. But no, I'm sorry, I can't remember.
The experiment.
So I'm interested, if you do these tricks, I mean, this is kind of a normalization, right?
Yep.
You know then pretty precisely where your arm is.
Fair.
If you have your eyes closed, do you forget where your body is?
Good question.
So if you don't, I mean, of course, if you concentrate, you can remember that.
Yeah, it's something that I've not done is to sort of, I've been pretty sad over the years in learning how to do certain things, but having to learn how to sit there with my arm out and fix it in a position for long periods, I've not done that. I know it will go there when I tell it to, and I know that I get a few seconds where it will roughly stay there, and I know that if I fold within a reasonable time frame, quite a short one, it's not going to have drifted too far, you know. So, you know, there are certain tricks that you can have, but you can only go so far with them. I very soon lose where I am in time and space if I'm not, you know, addressing that and managing that as part of going on in the background.
We always do experiments with Ian, not on him, because he has to understand. We have to ask him how he does something, but we never give him any knowledge of what we want him to do, except what's the minimum. Otherwise, he'll find a way around it, using a cue that we may or may not want him to use. And we always ask, how do you do it? And actually, the chapter is about the physiology of cheating, because it's how you do a motor task a different way to the one we might want. Come back to your question. We did some experiments in Marseille where Ian had to, he was in the dark, sitting down, he had a bite bar to immobilise his head. There was a very small spot of light in front, which gave no ambient light, and another spot of light, which moved slowly sideways. And the experiment was either watch that with your eyes moving, or keep your eye on the other small dot and let it go across your retina, or do a saccadic fast eye movement to where it is, and then you have to move your hand to where you think it is without seeing your hand. And he was better at the saccadic eye movement condition. In other words, you're perhaps not surprised, he can use the motor program of eye movement to guide how far he should use his hand. But the interesting thing was, at the end of each experiment, he had to get his hand back into the midpoint, and he could do that. He did it partly because he could hear how long he was moving, so he had to put it on something. Well, he had to put cans on his head to stop him doing that. To stop him using any temperature cue, he had to use a towel underneath and to reduce the friction. But he could still do it a bit, because he's got an awareness of roughly where his hand is when it's in the midpoint, because he's got an imagination of this, that, and the other. And we then did experiments where, in the same condition, the bite bar is very dangerous, because if he slips at all anywhere, then his teeth have gone. You've never been in a bite bar in the dark, but it is difficult for Ian. And we had conditions where finally we had his head in a bite bar, he was stable on a chair, and he had one spot of light, which wasn't ambient, in front of him, and he could make a movement from position A to position B that he'd learned. Because he knows his eyes are in the head, and they've not moved, the head hasn't moved, the body hasn't moved, therefore he's got a frame of reference to the external, well, the egocentric space. As soon as we turned out that small spot of light, he couldn't do it. Couldn't do it. A bit more of that. Well, let's move, we're a bit behind, so let's move on. This is gesture. This is David McNeil's lab in
the scene where
Chicago.
he uncovers a birdcage.
This was at the time when...
At first, Ian is worried about falling off his chair, so he doesn't gesture at all.
and he got outside.
Then he moves tentatively.
It's described as that sort of shape.
The impulse to gesture is there. Ian's timing is preserved, lending weight to McNeil's theory.
A bowling ball as being large and round.
Right.
But when Ian can't see his hands, his movements become imprecise.
You compared them.
As Ian said all along, without being able to see, body movement of any kind falls apart.
I can see the gesture in my head, but I just can't... I'm not quite sure whether the hands are doing this, but it was a...
His gestures might be prompted by instinct, but they are artificially performed.
Bowling ball. I can see the gesture in my head, but it's very difficult. And the reason I've been staring up at a little patch on the wall is to try and visualise what my hands are doing.
Gesture's more for kinetic, it's in relation to time, it's not accurate in space. Ian can make gestures for much longer. Most of his actions, instrumental actions, have a certain finite time because he can think ahead for a while and make a program, but then he needs to rest from it. So if he's walking, he might walk across here and then stop and do the next bit. Or most actions that we make are fractionated in time. Gesture carries on longer and Ian can gesture for longer. David McNeil thinks there's a thought, language, gesture system, which is a set of a movement pattern in the brain, which is different to that for instrumental action, and that although Ian initially learned to gesture because he had no gesture and had to think about gesture, now it's probably amongst the most automatic movements. But even David, when he analyses gesture, says although the temporal pattern in relation to language is normal and the shape is essentially normal, there's less of it and it tends to be more limited in time and duration than control subjects.
When I was first disabled, I was very aware that I was different. Not so much that I was propped up in a chair and whatever, but that I didn't gesture. And, you know, I worked very hard to achieve the level of gesturing that I have now. Some of it's automatic, quite a bit of it become automatic, and I work hard at making the rest of it looking automatic, you know. Because I wanted to interact and I wanted to engage, and gesture is absolutely crucial in that, so it was worth the effort. Getting things out of your pocket, not a problem. You know, I can forget that, something I didn't work on, couldn't be bothered. Gesture was, and it took a lot of effort. And, you know, I love to observe, you know, and you know, it was a struggle, it is something that I worked hard at, but fortunately, many elements of it have become easier over the years. Although we do have an ongoing debate with what came first, gesture or thought, but that's another debate.
This is some work we did a long time ago with Louis Merton, who's the son of Pat Merton, who was one of the first people to use transcranial magnetic stimulation, which I've shown here. For those who don't know, in that coil is a magnet, and it discharges a very short magnetic pulse. Into the head, which discharges, it produces sufficient current that it discharges some neurons in the brain. So that if you turn it up, you get a twitch like that. But we wanted to look at threshold when you hardly get any twitch at all, you're just getting a little twitch. Because if you make a voluntary movement about the same time, you're already facilitating certain neurons. So if you add TMS on top, you can see which neurons you're actually facilitating with your voluntary command. So we were trying to get at how focused is Ian's intention, i.e. his motor command, from I want to move a bit into the motor cortex, make it happen. And the way we did it is we put electrodes on various muscles in the forearm, one there, one there, one there, and one there. We asked Ian to make a movement of the thumb rhythmically, and then superimposed TMS on top of it as he was about to make the action. And here's me as a control, and what I'm doing is trying to move my thumb, which is APB muscle. As soon as there's a mag stim impulse that leads to that muscle that I'm focused on being twitched, and it's twitched within 20 milliseconds by the TMS, I'm also facilitating the other muscles around me. So my motor command, although I'm trying to move the thumb, I'm actually facilitating all the muscles in the forearm, which is not surprising because the hand moves as a whole. So we asked Ian as well, move your thumb, Ian, and at threshold, which is slightly lower than in controls, Ian moved his thumb. He had a TMS-induced twitch in 20 milliseconds, which is not conscious, just reflects his intention and the focus of the command. But he had no activation of other muscles surrounding him. And when you do integrated EMG of that, you see that control subjects, as soon as they activate one muscle to move the thumb, they're facilitating other muscles as well. Whereas Ian, there's no other muscle being facilitated, even at quite a high intensity of activation in this experiment. Ian's learned to move in a different way. His intention to motor command seems to be more focused in this condition than in controls. And then we asked him, well, imagine moving your thumb, Ian. And when we try to imagine moving our thumb, we're hopeless at imagining it in a way that reduces the threshold for a TMS-induced twitch, but also we're always involving other muscles as well. Whereas Ian, this is just purely imagining moving it. He was able to imagine it in a way that he facilitated motor cortex cells of the movement of that part alone. And not only that, but in some of these trials, we were stimulating him. In some of them, we put the magnet a bit higher off the scalp, so he had no pulse, so he didn't twitch. Sometimes he had his eyes shut, sometimes open, so we were shamming him. And on some trials, we asked him to imagine moving the thumb, and his eyes were open, and he saw a small twitch movement. And he was really indignant because he said he hadn't ordered the movement itself, he'd only imagined making the movement. So we were superimposing action onto an imagined condition, but even that imagined condition led to facilitation of motor cortex cells in Ian. Well, it interests us, at least.
Never did.
No. And we did it again recently with John Rothman and got the same result. But also, we found that probably there may be some slight inhibition of surrounding muscles as well in that condition. This is the PET study, which I'll go through in brief detail. We asked Ian to move the thumb against the finger, sequentially like that, to a metronome. And he could see his hand on a video screen when he was in the PET machine doing that too. Only we pre-recorded him moving, and we'd also got a recording of his hand not moving. So he could have conditions where he was moving and he saw his hand move, where he was moving but he saw a still hand, and vice versa. He saw his moving hand when his hand was actually not moving, or he could see a still hand when he was not moving. Okay? And the interesting conditions are essentially when he's moving the hand but he can't see the hand moving. In other words, he has a still hand that he sees. What does he do? And he's activating an area here in the parietal occipital area, which must be to do with vision. And you asked earlier what he does when he imagines moving. What he has to do is think of something, just imagine something. We suggest he imagines the moving hand, and this is what he's doing. And without being able to latch on to a moving hand, it's difficult for him to make the intention to move. So he's closing a loop by using visual imagination of the movement when he has no feedback of it. And that, I think that's sufficient. Is that fair, Ian?
Yeah, I can't remember much about it anyway, to be honest.
Well, the question is, when you can't see a movement, you very rarely make
I
movements.
don't know how to elaborate in any way that would be useful.
The other evidence that he is elaborating these ideas or programs about movement in the future, free-forward programs, is from mirror drawing. A long time ago, GL did an experiment where she was asked on a table like this to draw around the Star of David with her hand. Very simple. And the end result was how fast can you get round? But the only feedback you got was in a mirror. And each time, you're not too bad at the strokes of this. These are complex figures, but you're not too bad going along a straight line. But when you get to a corner, you see it going one way, and it's the wrong way in the mirror, so you have to compensate. And how do you overcome that mismatch? GL could do it first time as fast as she did it the fifth time, basically. And the idea was that she could go around the mirror, tracing it out, because she had no mismatch between what she saw and her proprioceptive feedback. So she just used what she saw. And as I said, she tends to use online visual feedback. She doesn't elaborate these programs. So we did it with Ian, and the result was that Ian was slightly better than controls, but he still got stuck at all the corners. And he doesn't have a mismatch between proprioception, what he feels he's going, where he's going, what he feels in the hand, and where the vision tells him to go. But he does have a mismatch between where he's intending to go and the vision. So I think the mismatch here is between he sees what he's asked to do, and he makes a program. I've got to go here, 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 here. And when he has vision, which mismatches with that program, he gets stuck. And GL doesn't get stuck because she doesn't elaborate a program. She just follows where she needs to go. I think the elaboration of these programs, thinking about movement in the head before you do it, is one reason why Ian's been so successful in doing what he does.
And I remember that test. Amazingly. I actually remember that test because it was set up as a challenge. We did this in Canada with GL there and I was there and what have you. There were great expectations and, I was so annoyed, unbelievably annoyed that I was beaten. But for the reasons that Jonathan said. But some tests you remember, some you don't.
Do you mind saying something about writing? So when you write, what are you using and how are you writing? Because you can't see your lower fingers. So how do you go about writing?
Pencil.
Oh, yes.
If I don't stay in a hotel, I don't get pens. I don't hold fine dexterously like most people would. I just clamp it across my first finger. That's it. And most of the movement will be from the wrist. And that's it, it's as simple as that, really. My writing is appalling, although I can't spell it. But it is bad. You know, it's not good, my writing. But it never was beforehand. I've got school reports that can prove that. So I'm not really that upset. But I can sign my name and cheques when they were in fashion. And so I can get by and I can write. But it's a labour. It's not something that I do often these days. You know. But it's just a clamp. It's mostly from the wrist. You know, I don't get that fine, dexterous movement that you would probably have.
Ian had to go to his bank after he relearned to write because the handwriting was unrecognisable compared to beforehand.
I should know about that.
I'm very aware of the time. If you go on another 10 minutes, as always happens, it's much more interesting to talk to Ian and look at the phenomenology of it than to look at the science where we're trying to follow it. So I'm going to miss out some of the science and do more videos and have Ian describe. And he talked about paper clips, and this is Charles and his paper clips.
Okay, you're fine. Silly me. But it does show you sort of Charles in the early stages of trying to do what he'd always done. We also showed him how to throw a ball as well, which is an interesting exercise. But once we got him to focus, to rest his hand on the hard surface, in this case the box, he was much, much quicker. As soon as he was focused, he was able to achieve the task. And with repetition, we get much, much faster. But it's stripping movement down to the bare essentials, getting rid of the things you didn't need, some of the fingers you didn't need, fixing it in position and working with what you only need, not all the other stuff.
In engineering and motor control terms, it's reducing the degrees of freedom.
There you go.
Which Ian discovered on his own. Most of what he did, everything he did, he learned on his own, basically. This is him doing paper clips.
That's because no one would work with me.
It's because his physiotherapists didn't really understand what was wrong with Ian, but they saw that he was very motivated. So they supported him in doing whatever he felt he had to do, even though I went afterwards and asked Yvonne Boyer, who is chief physiotherapist, what was wrong with Ian? He was there 17 months. He's the longest person probably in rehabilitation history at that hospital.
Yeah.
And she said, I don't know what was wrong with him. But we put up with him and we gave him time to learn how to do what he needed to do. You may not have noticed, but Ian had a little glitch in that because he was trying to do it. He was performing rather too well.
Yeah. It's not the water, you just throw them in to say you're human.
10 minutes. We didn't do it last time, we're not going to do it this time. But we've done a lot of work on, I'll briefly go through the fact that we've done a lot of work. If you look at how many fibres there are in the peripheral nerve that are sensory, there are a huge number that are very small fibres. Why are there so many to do with pain and temperature? So we've been looking, what else might those fibres do? And the answer is that those fibres, I hope you read that. In addition, there's a system slowly conducting unmyelinated C fibres responding to light touch, which previously wasn't known. And this was in GL. We need to look at GL and IW in patients like that because all these large fibres that tell us about touch get in the way of these experiments. You need to get rid of the A-beta fibres to see what the CT fibres are doing. And when you activate these CT fibres, there's a faint sensation. And when you look, I'll go on to that faint sensation. In fMRI, you see that these don't go to the normal sensory areas, they go to the insular areas, which are to do with emotional, hormonal and affiliative or social responses to caress. The idea is that this fibre system, which is comparatively recently shown, is actually underpinning in non-human primates grooming behaviour, for instance, where the grooming behaviour is known not to be to pick off the ticks, but for social reinforcement and bonding. And in us, caress, social touch, is something that may be underpinned by CT afferents rather than the large fibre afferents, and there's good evidence for that. This is the experiment in GL. If she's asked, is she touched with a brush on the hand, on the dorsum, the back of the hand, she can say, the question is there a touch? And you don't know. You have to say yes or no. And when they're given an alternative of a forced choice, they say yes pretty well 100% of the time. I have been touched. On the glabrous skin, these CT afferents are not present, so she's a chance. And the controls of bars are 100%, they know they've been touched. And the vibration, which is a pure A beta large fibre function, GL was a chance everywhere. And in temperature, she was pretty well normal. But then they asked, okay, on the back of the hand or the forearm, how intense is the feeling of having been touched? Eyes shut the whole time. And the intensity of touch was quite low. But how pleasant was whatever happened when you say something did happen? And there, the pleasantness was really high. So the experimenter dissociated the perception of having been touched from the feeling of something pleasant, which was a brush, which is an extraordinary idea to consider, that you can dissociate these two. And when you looked in a scanner to see where she was activating in association with this pleasantness of touch, control subjects, premotor cortex and S1 particularly, and some of S2 and the insula. But in GL it was purely insular, a bit of premotor cortex, but the insula is the area we're particularly interested in, to do with affiliative, social, pleasant touch, caress. The same area that hunger, thirst, sexual function, etc., sexual gratification is concerned with. And we did the same thing with Ian. Ian mentioned his back problem. He didn't mention that he's quite claustrophobic, which he is.
Seriously.
Which is why we can't do many functional imaging experiments, because that's a confined space. But he did consent to this one. But he wasn't happy. And he wasn't happy because he couldn't see his body. He wasn't happy because he had a bit of backache. But we still got this result from pleasant touch, which just reinforces to me how secure it is. And also we found deactivation of some sensory cortex at the same time. Here. Sorry. Sorry, I'm going backwards, that's why. I thought I put too many slides. When you actually do von Frey-Hare in Ian and Jeanette, which are supposed to be a testing of A beta or light touch, you actually find that on the forearm where these CT afferents are, they're a bit above normal, but they're still quite low in force. And these CT afferents may underpin even this sensation of touch. So von Frey-Hare is not a particularly pure way of looking at A beta fibres. The monofilaments or von Frey-Hare on the palm, they're huge, the thresholds, because you don't have CT afferents there. Glabrous skin is very different. And this is interesting. When you ask, you're being stroked, Ian or Jeanette, where are you being stroked? They can say they're being stroked, but they don't always know which leg or which arm it is. So this pleasantness is very much a function of pleasantness, but not of localization. It's extraordinary to think, Ian, you've been stroked. No, I haven't. I know I haven't. Well, all right, we know that, but just say yes or no on the basis of probability, and then he's quite high. So this perception is really at the boundaries of perception, if you like.
Well, that's grumpy.
Yeah. But then, where is it? And sometimes they don't get it, even though they know they've been touched. And that's the same there. And a more recent experiment that Håkan Olaussen's group, who's done most of this work, did, They did microneurography, so they're recording from individual axons, individual nerves in a peripheral nerve up here. And then they isolated the receptive field of the nerve, so the cutaneous end organ. So a given single axon goes to one particular bit of skin. And whilst still in that recording from that single axon, in a conscious person, they then stimulate the receptive field by stroking. And you get this response. So a CT afferent, when it's stroked, tends to fire more as you stroke slowly than if you stroke fast, because it's interested in caress. Whereas the large fibres that we've all got, the hair cells, they just fire off the whole time, regardless. And then if you plot how pleasant the feeling is that you're giving, and then you plot how the CT afferent is responding in terms of frequency, compared with how the A beta fibres, the light touch that we all have, respond, you see that the psychophysics, as you get faster, it's not as pleasant. So it's slow movement that's interesting, CT afferents, here. As the firing frequency goes down as you get fast, and they say it's less pleasant as you get faster with the stimulus. And the A beta, the usual touch fibres, just respond according to how fast you go. So this is evidence that from the psychophysics and the firing qualities of individual nerve axons in the skin, that these CT afferents are related to the pleasantness of touch. That's what you're using. That's what we're all using, not the light touch fibres. And if you plot CT firing here against pleasantness, you get a linear plot, which is quite good science, really. I have nothing to do with it. This is a little trip we had on NASA's zero-gravity vomit comet. Ian will talk about it at the end of the film, perhaps. With this and one other film to go.
I was saying earlier about, I put my trust in Jonathan. This is where it was significantly challenged. But seriously. Personally, I lived up to the name of the thing and I vomited for England and won. Jonathan is not normal. He was not sick. And although I was asked to go again the following day, I declined as there was no research value to it. Jonathan went again because he enjoyed the ride. It says a lot about the neurologist, I think.
We're very fortunate to go. To be in zero gravity is an astonishing experience. It really is. You can hear the sound go off, and that's when you're going over the top, and you're now in 0G. And I'm supposed to be doing knee bends here. And in 0G, when you make a knee bend, you think you haven't gone very far, and as you make a knee bend, the floor moves away from you. And if in 2G, because you get twice as long in 2G as you get 0G, because you're doing that down. In 2G, you think you've made a really deep knee bend when you just do that, because of the forces on your legs are so great. And as you make that small movement, the floor rushes up to meet you. It changes perception in a very odd way. And when you're standing there, you go into 0G, and you look out, and everyone's on the ceiling. Because you imagine, without any pressure on the inner ear, you think you must be upside down. But you know you're not upside down, so you think the world must be upside down instead. So you think everyone's on the ceiling. Extraordinary. That's deep knee bends in 2G. Not very deep. Unfortunately, Jim Lackner, he's astonishing. In order to do those experiments, we'd already been to Boston to do the same experiments in 1G in exactly the same space. I.e., he had all those three experiments running together, and then he gets all the kit onto a van, and he drives it to Houston and sets it up on the machine, exactly the same in the plane as it was in his lab in order to do those experiments. But unfortunately, we still had a glitch with Ian's results, so we didn't get much from that, except I got a fun ride.
You had a fun ride, and I'm not doing it again.
Yeah. This is the last one.
I don't feel that I'm special at all. I know I have an unusual condition, but I'm just getting on with life. And that's it. I sat here one evening, and one of the nurses had come in and we were chatting about something or other. And I put my arm across her and touched her breast, and she slapped my face. And the thing was that, and she was quite right, I mean I had sort of like invaded her privacy, but I didn't have a clue that I'd done it, so I didn't even have the benefit of having known that I'd touched her.
Okay, we finished. Thank you very much.
Anything?
Yes.
Don't go away.
I observed you when you were talking and always holding the microphone, but you didn't always look at the microphone.
No.
Or did you?
No, once you set it somewhere, you just freeze the posture. Yeah, you freeze posture.
You freeze the posture. And it's what you do very often, I guess.
Yeah. And that's the strategies that I use for that one, you know. The reason I move around a lot on the floor is it's harder to hit a moving target, I worked out. So, you know, if you're going to throw anything, I keep moving, we're not going to be able to hit you. But it's just a simple one, that one. Just freezing a posture, and that's it. They will drift. You will attend to it occasionally, depending on how valuable the item is in your hand, and it's electronic, so it's expensive. So I will attend, but not a lot. If it was an egg, I would attend significantly. If it was a rubber ball that bounced, I don't care. You know. It depends on what's there as to how much effort you put into it.
Because I observed, I had Gia here, and she was always smoking. And she would put her arm like this, and the cigarette there, and she would take a bottle of wine or whatever, and talk at the same time. And she pretended to me at the time that she was always having a vision on the periphery, that she was always controlling her cigarettes on the periphery. Is it possible for you also to have things there and have a large peripheral vision?
Yeah, I mean, I can see Jonathan and how he stood there, and I can see my partner sat over here and how she sat, and I do attend to those sort of things, but I can let them go at the moment because I'm sat here and safe, and you know, and they're quite a long way away. But if they were walking towards me, I would start attending, even though we're having a conversation. You know. It's why I talk so much rubbish, is because I have to attend to so many other things. That's the problem, you know. But yeah, I will attend, but you can be in a safer position where you can manage. It's less, and the effort is then less. So it's a good question.
How is it to get distracted by a sound or by a smell? And have you developed technologies to avoid too much interferences, cognitive
We live in a remote area, quite a quiet area, and we occasionally get fast jets that go over. And if I'm sat down and they go over, it's fine. It's not going to distract me that much that I will lose my concentration and fall. If I was stood or doing something fine and dexterous, I may lose touch with where I was while I was distracted with the sound and what have you. But the thing that annoys me with that is it puts my chickens off lane, which is a serious problem for me. You know, but I can manage the issue usually. But sound, I use sound quite a lot. I will listen for things that are happening in background if someone's approaching me. Particularly when I was standing and walking more, I would certainly be attending to footsteps and things like that, you know. And I would use sound as a recognition or acknowledgement that I would put something down. So if I was trying to cut down, I would listen for that, and that's an acknowledgement as much as a visual clue. So you do pick up on things like that. As for technologies, I don't use any bits of kit or anything. I don't have any sported hearing equipment or anything like that. But it's just an element that I use in a way that enables me to be safer or more mobile. Temperature is another one that I would use, temperature under the arm, or if you lean forward, you know that you've done certain things. Pain's another one that you can tap into, you know, as to an acknowledgement that you've moved at a certain energy or something. But it's all those clues that you sort of tap into. Is that okay?
One last question.
In what way, if any, was there a change in the way you observed other people moving after the illness?
Did you have to say one last question? That's a difficult one. It's a very good question. I think I've always been interested in movement. I think I've always been interested in movement. I was fascinated. I used to be a runner when I was at school, and I've always been, I played sport and all those sort of things. And I've always been interested. But as soon as I was deprived of easy, natural movement, I became very focused on how other people move. How can this gentleman sit here with his elbows on the desk with that lady without having to think really hard about it, How can someone walk, gracefully up and down the steps? And I started to watch and observe. And at home the other week, we had someone doing some digging in the garden, and I thought, they're not doing that in the most effective way. They're going to damage their back in a little while. And, but they were digging a hole for me, so I didn't get on with it, I didn't interfere. And they got away with it. But I have become fascinated by movement, and much more acutely so than I ever was before. But I've always had an interest in it. Always had an interest.
We have done some work on this. We have done a bit of work on this with Simone Bosbach. And Ian and GL, when they watch an actor picking up a box of unknown weight, they're as good as the actors at judging the weight, which is very like the experiment I described. But when we asked, on most of the trials, the weight was what we said it was. But occasionally we told the actors the wrong weight. And GL and Ian were slightly reduced on the expectation of the other person of the weight that they were picking it up. And we suggested that because they don't have the motor programs implicitly, non-consciously, for the expectation of weight, as you and I do, they're unable to access those implicit programs that we think may underlie that judgment.
Well, thank you very much. So please come down here. We have like 2-3 minutes to walk down. So some of you who may have one quick question might come and ask him. No more, bro. Thank you very much for coming here.
Thank you.